What would you do if a group of neighbors sent the actual police to your front door just because you refused to pay dues to an HOA you never agreed to join? Now, what if I told you the story gets 100 times better because the person they called the cops on, he owned the streets those HOA board members drove on every single day. Every single day. They parked their HOA meeting cars on his private property and never even knew it. This is the story of Gary, an ordinary homeowner who turned into every HOA Karen's worst nightmare. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll be standing up in your chair. Hit that subscribe button right now, and don't you dare click away, because the moment this HOA learned the truth, their entire power trip collapsed in real time. Welcome back to Neighbor Wars HQ, the channel where real people, real property lines, and real legal rights collide in the most satisfying ways imaginable. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of the most jaw-dropping, legally fascinating, and deeply satisfying neighborhood disputes I have ever come across in all my years running this channel. Before we get into it, if you're new here, this is the place you come when your neighbor puts up a fence 6 inches onto your land, when an HOA board member power trips at the mailbox, or when someone discovers a technicality so perfectly timed it feels like it was written by a Hollywood screenwriter. We cover it all. Real stories, real outcomes, real justice. Today's story comes from a man I'm going to call Gary, not his real name, but everything else about this story is completely real. Gary bought his home in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 12 years ago. He did everything right. He hired a real estate attorney. He read his deed. He checked the CC and RS, that's the covenants, conditions, and restrictions for the area. And what Gary found, buried deep in the paperwork, was something that would take more than a decade to become the most powerful card he'd ever play. Gary's home was not, I repeat, not part of the homeowners association that controlled the surrounding neighborhood. His parcel predated the HOA's formation. It was a quirk of the development's history, a single lot that had been sold off before the HOA was even incorporated. Gary knew this. His attorney knew this. And for years, it didn't really matter because the HOA left him alone. That peace didn't last. About 3 years ago, the HOA in Gary's neighborhood went through a leadership change. A new board president, let's call her Diane, moved in from out of state, and from day one, Diane was the kind of person who read the HOA rulebook like it was scripture. New fines started appearing. Neighbors got warning letters for having the wrong color of mulch. Someone got cited for a wind chime. A wind chime. But Diane had a vision. She wanted 100% HOA participation in the neighborhood. In her mind, every house, every lot, every blade of grass in that zip code should be under HOA governance. So when her board pulled the community roster and noticed that Gary's address wasn't in the system, wasn't paying dues, wasn't attending meetings, and wasn't subject to any of the rules, she took it personally. Gary got a letter, politely worded at first. It welcomed him to the community and invited him to formalize his membership. Gary wrote back equally politely, attaching a copy of his deed and a brief note explaining that his property predated the HOA and that he had never been subject to its rules, never signed any agreement, and had no legal obligation to join. He wished them well and left it at that. The second letter was less polite. It referenced community cohesion. It mentioned property values. It implied, without quite saying, that Gary's non-membership was somehow harming his neighbors. Gary sent the same response, this time with a slightly longer legal explanation. The third letter threatened fines. Gary sent a cease and desist, drafted by his attorney. That's when Diane decided to escalate. She called the non-emergency police line and reported, and I want you to really hear this, she reported that a resident was refusing to comply with community rules and was being hostile. 2 officers showed up at Gary's front door on a Tuesday afternoon. Now here is where most people would panic. Most people would stumble over their words, get defensive, maybe even back down just to avoid the drama. Not Gary. Gary had been waiting for this moment, not out of spite, but out of pure, calm preparation. He answered the door, greeted the officers professionally, and before they could even fully explain why they were there, he said, "Officers, I'm going to save us all some time. I'm not a member of that HOA. I never have been. I never will be. I have documentation proving that my property predates their incorporation, I have a cease and desist on file with their board, and I'd be happy to show you all of it right now." The officers, to their enormous credit, did exactly what you'd hope a well-trained officer would do. They listened. They looked at the documents Gary produced. They called their supervisor. And within 20 minutes, they told Gary what he already knew. This was a civil matter, there was nothing illegal happening, and there was nothing they could do. They apologized for disturbing him and left. But Diane wasn't done. She called again the following week with a new claim that Gary's property was somehow violating the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Another visit. Same outcome. Gary, still calm, still documented, still completely in the right. By this point, Gary had started keeping a very detailed log. Every letter, every call, every visit, dates, times, names, badge numbers. He wasn't doing this out of anger. He was doing it because he knew, based on that same careful research he'd done 12 years earlier, that he had something far bigger in his back pocket. See, here's what Diane and her HOA board never bothered to find out. When Gary purchased his property, the deal included more than just his residential lot. The original parcel sale that predated the HOA's development had included the private road easements that connected his property to the surrounding neighborhood. Over time, as the development was built up around him, those road easements had evolved into the primary internal streets of the community, the streets that every single HOA member used daily to get in and out of their homes. Gary owned them, legally, on paper, in the county recorder's office. The HOA had been built around private roads that belonged to someone who wasn't in their HOA. Nobody had ever checked. Nobody had ever asked. It had just never come up because Gary was a reasonable, live and let live kind of guy who hadn't wanted trouble. But now they had sent police to his house twice. Now, they had been fining him for rules he had no obligation to follow. Now, his attorney had drafted not one, but 3 letters that had been ignored. Gary made a phone call, not to the police, not to the HOA, to the county assessor's office to request certified documentation of exactly what he owned. What he got back confirmed everything. He owned approximately 8 miles of internal road running through the heart of the HOA neighborhood. He called a meeting with his attorney. They drafted a very formal, very detailed letter addressed, not just to the board, but to every individual homeowner in the HOA. The letter explained, in plain language, that Gary was the legal owner of the roads they had been using, that he had been tolerant of this arrangement for years, that he had no interest in disrupting the community unnecessarily. But given the HOA's recent conduct, harassment, the police calls, the threats, he felt it was important for every resident to understand the legal landscape. The letter concluded with a very simple statement. Gary had not yet decided what he intended to do with his property, but he wanted everyone to know he was aware of his rights. The response was immediate and, frankly, spectacular. Diane's phone started ringing off the hook from her own board members. Homeowners who had been perfectly happy sipping their HOA Kool-Aid suddenly had a very urgent interest in property law. An emergency board meeting was called. Gary was invited to attend suddenly. The HOA wanted to talk. Suddenly, they were very interested in having a conversation. Gary attended, with his attorney. He was calm, measured, and absolutely in control of the room from the moment he sat down. The board had brought their own attorney, who had clearly spent the previous 48 hours in a near-panic reviewing the title records. Their attorney confirmed on the record, in front of every homeowner present, Gary's ownership of the roads was legitimate and legally airtight. Diane, for the first time since moving into the neighborhood, had nothing to say. The HOA's attorney outlined what private road ownership could mean. Gary could, within his legal rights, restrict access. He could gate the roads. He could charge an access fee. He could require easement agreements. None of these outcomes were what the HOA wanted, and every single one of them was entirely within Gary's rights as the legal owner. Gary didn't ask for money. He didn't demand revenge. What Gary asked for was simple, reasonable, and utterly brilliant. A formal written acknowledgement from the HOA board that his property was exempt from their rules, that they would cease all contact and cease all threats, and that they would send a letter of apology to Gary on official HOA letterhead acknowledging their error in contacting law enforcement over a non-existent violation. The board agreed. Every item, without a single negotiation. The letter was delivered within the week. Gary still lives in that house. The HOA still exists. The roads still run through his property. And as far as anyone knows, the arrangement continues quietly because Gary, despite having every legal card in the deck, chose to play it with dignity rather than devastation. He didn't want to blow up the neighborhood. He just wanted to be left alone. And that, right there, is the difference between someone who uses legal knowledge as a weapon and someone who uses it as a shield. Gary didn't go looking for this fight. He prepared, he documented, and when the fight came to him, he was ready. There's a lesson in this story for every single person watching, whether you're dealing with an overreaching HOA, a nightmare neighbor, or just someone who thinks rules apply to everyone except the people making them. Know your property. Read your deed. Hire a real estate attorney at least once in your homeowning life. And when someone sends the cops to your door over a wind chime, stay calm, stay documented, and let the paperwork do the talking. That is everything for today here at Neighbor Wars HQ. If this story gave you the satisfaction you came here for, smash that like button, drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in Gary's shoes, and subscribe so you never miss another story like this one. We post new Neighbor Wars, HOA nightmares, and property dispute deep dives every single week. And if you have a story about a real, documented, unbelievable situation with an HOA, a neighbor, a landlord, or a property dispute, send it to us. The link is in the description. Your story could be our next video. Until next time, know your rights, know your deed, and never let anyone convince you that you owe them something you don't. This is Neighbor Wars HQ. See you next week.